We continue our study of the book of Exodus. We are in Exodus, the 20th chapter. We left off at verse 22. And we saw already how that God has set barriers on the mountain. If you were here Wednesday night, Randall Bailey went into a little bit of detail about that concerning the holiness of God and the holiness of Israel and how we are to be holy today. And so all of that is described, the boundaries that are set forth initially there, up through verse 21. Then verse 22 says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, You yourself have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven. You shall not make other gods besides me. Gods of silver or gods of gold you shall not make for yourselves. You shall make an altar of earth for me, and shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. And every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make an altar of stone for me, you shall not build it of cut stones. For if you wield your tool on it, you will profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, so that your nakedness will not be exposed on it." Unusual restrictions that are posed upon the Israelites upon making the altars to God. Now there were reasons for they were not to make gods of silver, gods of gold. They should not make all those kinds of gods. And he's already talked about that in the 10 words, what we call the 10 commandments that we've already looked at. An altar of earth, a place of sacrificial slaughter, is what the Israelites were to make for themselves. A simple mound of earth, a simple mound of rough stones. That was what they were to do, something simple. In contrast to the elaborate rituals and the elaborate finery of the idols and the idol worship of the day, Israel was to do things that were simple. Only a simple mound was necessary for worshiping the Lord. The burnt offerings that he mentions, the peace offerings that he mentions, these will be discussed later as it goes through the law code. But here he just mentions them in passing. As you offer burnt offerings and peace offerings, this is what you are to do. He said that he would cause certain places to be designated for altars, and they were not chosen indiscriminately. They were chosen on purpose. He talks about elaborate and intricately carved altars being forbidden there in verse 25. Not only because such altars were used in idolatrous worship, but perhaps also that their very ornateness tended to distract from simple and pure and spiritual worship. Do you see what God's doing already? He's contrasting the kind of worship he desires with the kind of worship that's being done in pagan idolatry, which you have elaborate pomp and circumstance. God says, don't have any of that. Worship me simply. And we see that same principle today, don't we, in the New Testament? New Testament worship is simple. New Testament worship is not with a lot of pomp and circumstance and a lot of finery and a lot of show things. No. A group of people can worship God simply wherever they choose to meet. If you are in a place where there's no church building, yet there's a gathering of Christians, you can gather together in any kind of place, whether it's under a tree, whether it's in a rented hall, whether it's in a school building, whether it's in a person's house. You can worship God anywhere according to what God has instructed. It's a simple spiritual form of worship. And it's in marked contrast with all of the show and the special effects that take place in so many denominational churches today. You look at the interdenominational churches and the mega churches and the different kinds of so-called worship they engage in, where there's a lot of light shows, and there's even the sound system rivals a rock music sound system where the decibel level is on up there. That's not the worship that God has instructed in the New Testament. It's a simple worship that involves everyone and does not elevate people to a showmanship kind of thing. Well, this is that same principle that's enunciated here by God in the worship that the Hebrews are to engage in versus the worship that the pagan idols have. You shall not go up by steps, verse 26, that your nakedness will not be exposed. Apparently, this was a matter of propriety because the climbing of steps while clad in a short robe would bring about improper exposure. But then later on in chapter 28, verses 42 and 43, we're going to see that special garments were required for the priests, and that would take care of some of this. As of this moment, he's just instructing them of what they are to do up until the point where they can completely fulfill the requirements of God as far as the tabernacle and the priests and all of that. So we come to chapter 21, and we have now really the beginning of the law code. We've seen the prelude to this with the 10 words, the 10 commandments, and these kinds of preliminary statements that God makes to Moses, through Moses to the people. And in chapter 21, he says, "These are the ordinances which you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years. But on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment." Now the form in which this ordinance is stated here by God to Moses, to the Israelites, is quite different from the absolutes, the absolute imperatives and the prohibitions of the 10 commandments or the 10 words. The present passage that we're talking about here begins with a general situation when you buy, and then goes on to consider specific cases, which is introduced by the word if, such as if he comes, verse 3. If his master gives, verse 4. If the slave plainly says, verse 5. These kinds of laws have been termed casuistic laws, as distinction from the absolute commands, which are called apodictic laws. Casuistic laws based on situations, apodictic laws which are universal, and it is absolute. This has a lot in common with the law codes of the ancient Near East. And we, of course, won't go into detail about that because it'll take too much time and it'll get you bored. But still, these kinds of laws, these apodictic laws that we're going to see, are distinctively Israelite. The ones that are absolute, the ones that deal with absolute commands. These, though, are the casuistic laws. The basis of all the laws of the law of Moses, including those regulations similar to the ordinances of other ancient peoples, is the unique act of God revealing himself and calling Israel into covenant. He's calling them into covenant with him. And now he's going to be dealing with specific situations. And he says here, if you buy a Hebrew slave. The term Hebrew there is a little bit problematic in the text. Now, Bailey goes into great detail about the text in his commentary. What I'll say on this is simply this. The word that's translated Hebrew here is also translated Israelite in other places. Hebrew was not a generally used term at this point by the Israelites to refer to themselves. It was referred to by the Egyptians toward the Israelites. But as far as referring to themselves, they didn't refer to themselves as Hebrew. This is an Israelite, or a slave that is a domestic. In other words, from within the country. So that's what he's addressing here. He shall serve for 6 years. On the 7th, he shall go out as a free man without payment. Now this will tie in with Deuteronomy 15, 12 through 18, which goes in a little bit more detail about this. The fact of the matter was, in the ancient Near East, there was slaves, and there were slavery that was taking place. And it would be the case with Israel, that there would be slaves. And then verse 3, if he comes alone, he shall go out alone. Then if he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man, then the master shall bring him to God, then he shall bring him to the door of the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. There's a lot to unpack in this verse. He says, then his master shall bring him to God, the New American Standard Bible says. Other translations say bring him to the judges. Likely the term is referring to the sanctuary. The sanctuary that is in the tabernacle specifically. Later on, it's going to be the temple. But in the immediate sense, he's referring to the temple. Bring him to God, which means bring him in the presence of God. The judges would be involved in this, but this would be taking place in the sanctuary. Master shall pierce his ear with an awl. There's a song that our young people sing sometimes called Pierce My Ear, and it's based on this. This is simply a symbol that this man will be with this family, with his master on a permanent basis. To our 21st century mentality, this is somewhat jarring. Why is this here? Well, the fact is, slavery was a reality in the ancient Near East. And God put regulations on this for the Israelites for them to follow. And all of this is governed by the goodness and the mercy and the compassion of God. The compassion of God is seen throughout this section. How the Israelites were to treat others. This goes back to the second great commandment, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, as Jesus would say. This develops that kind of thought. In verse 7, if a master sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. This is a new series of cases having to do with regulations in regard to the girl sold as a slave wife by her father. Now, it should be borne in mind that a very poor man might secure in ancient society a better life for his daughter by selling her than by not selling her. That's in certain situations in that day and time. She shall not go out. Ordinarily, when a man sold his daughter into slavery, the contract stipulated that the daughter was to be taken as a slave wife or as a concubine by the man or one of his sons. So the slavery, this kind of slavery was quite different from the debtor slave that we just saw in verse 2 and following. And the relationship was not automatically terminated after 6 years. So he goes on to say in verse 8, if she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people. Remember, this is Hebrews now, or these are the Israelites, because of his unfairness to her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. You see the difference. He is to treat her honorably. He is to treat her properly. He is to treat her fairly. This is the difference between the Israelite code and all the other codes that were in existence that were governed by idolatry and idolatrous worship. Verse 10, if he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food or clothing or conjugal rights. If he will not do these three things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. So in other words, if he doesn't follow these rules, then she's free to go. Now, this was understood to be under the governorship of the judges. The judges would take care of these specific situations as they would be brought up to them. So these kinds of regulations, these kinds of rules, if followed by the Israelites, would ensure that people are going to be treated fairly. And as we're going to see as we go through these regulations, we're going to see God's special care to make sure that those who are innocent and those who are poor are taken care of. Verse 12. He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. Death penalty. The death penalty for homicide. Taking someone's life, as we would say, with malice aforethought. Death penalty. But If he did not lie in wait for him, you see, there's the qualifier to what he's just said. You're lying in wait for someone. You're ready to kill that person. You strike him, you kill him, you're to be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint you a place to which he may flee. Someone might say, what about negligent or manslaughter? Somebody is killed, you didn't intend for it to happen, yet in the course of doing, it happens. Well, he says, I'm going to appoint a place. Now, what is that place? Later on, we're going to see it's the cities of refuge. There are certain cities of refuge that are appointed by God throughout the nation of Israel where someone can flee in this kind of situation and wait for the judicial ruling about his specific case. Verse 14, if, however, a man acts presumptuously toward his neighbor so as to kill him craftily, you are to take him even from my altar, that he may die. What about a situation where someone plots and someone schemes and it's not automatically apparent that this person took someone's life or had his life taken, and then it comes out in the course of events, this is the person that was behind all of this. What's to happen? Well, that person has no asylum whatsoever. He can say, oh, I didn't actually take the life of that individual. Yes, but the evidence indicates that you plotted. You plotted against that person. You had people to do it for you. Well, you can't go to the city of refuge. You have no recourse. You're going to be put to death, just as much as if you actually struck the death blow. How often do we see those kind of cases today? All too often. If you watch Dateline NBC or 48 Hours, you'll see it all the time. I know because I watch both those shows. But you'll see them about somebody plotting against someone. And intricate plots are crafted. That's what he's talking about here in this verse. Verse 15. He who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Wow. What does that tell you? That tells you that father and mother are to be honored. They are to be elevated. You are to show respect. You are to show honor toward your parents. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with promise. We've already seen that mentioned in the 10 words, the 10 commandments. And now we see the reinforcement of this. If you hit your father or if you hit your mother, you're going to be put to death. It's that serious. Then he says, verse 16, he who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. Kidnapping. How often do we see kidnapping take place in these United States? Even in 2020. It happens. And it's tragic every time it takes place. Well, it would happen in Israel. And if it came out that someone kidnapped another person, death penalty. Death penalty toward that person. Verse 17, he who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Jesus would refer to that in Matthew 15:14. Cursing your parents. I don't know about you, but that just completely blows my mind. That someone would intentionally curse their mother and father. And not only to their face, but in public to other people. And yet we know that it happens, doesn't it? All too often. God wants father and mother respected, honored, elevated. And that's what he's reinforcing with these laws. That is in sharp contrast with pagan idolatry, with pagan systems of government. All of this is reinforcing, or it should reinforce, in the mind of the common Israelite, God wants me to be better. God wants me to be separate from all the nations that are around me. He wants me to be like him. That's the point of all of this. If men have a quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist and he does not die but remains in bed, if he gets up and walks around outside on his staff, then he who struck him shall go unpunished. He shall only pay for his loss of time and shall take care of him until he is completely healed. The context of this passage is something happens at work. Two guys are working and they have an argument. and in the course of the argument there maybe is a struggle, and one and the other hits the person, and that person is severely injured because of this rage, this anger that takes place. Well, the person who struck the individual who is now injured is responsible for the well-being and the health of that individual. You're to take care of that person. You're to pay half of his time at work. Do you see here the care that's being shown by God toward the common Israelite? Of course. Verse 20. If a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. There's that care and concern being shown even toward the slave. If, however, he survives a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property. It's a serious matter. But if he dies, then you're going to be punished for it. If men struggle with each other and strike a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet there is no injury, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband may demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. Even the unborn are taken into consideration by God here. Verse 23. But if there is any further injury, then you shall appoint as a penalty life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, we hear. This is where this comes from. Not only here, but also we see that this principle that is enunciated is the principle of lex talionis. I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly. It's an ancient principle of punishment which permitted equivalent legal retaliation for injury or for death. This principle sets limits upon retaliation and serves to prohibit or prevent excessive vengeance. The correct amount of vengeance can be taken. Any more than that is not allowed. Further, except in certain cases, such as described in Numbers 35, it seems that monetary compensation could be substituted if the offended party was agreeable to it. Although the lex talionis was itself an improvement upon unrestricted vengeance, in the book of Matthew, we're going to see that Jesus taught a higher way of dealing with private offenses. Turn the other cheek. This is an improvement, no doubt, what God says through Moses. But Jesus' way is absolutely the best way. Verse 26, if a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. And if he knocks out a tooth of his male or female slave, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth. Protecting the slave. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall surely be stoned, its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall go unpunished. If, however, an ox was previously in the habit of goring, and its owner has been warned, yet he does not confine it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and the owner also shall be put to death. If a ransom is demanded of him, then he shall give him for the redemption of his life whatever is demanded of him. You see the protection to the innocent? Even with a runaway animal, the owner of that animal is held responsible for whatever damage is done. Whether it gores a son or daughter, it should be done to him according to the same rule. If the ox gores a male or female slave, the owner shall give his or her master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. You see what's happening here? Protection. Protection of life. If a man opens a pit or digs a pit and does not cover it over, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead animal shall become his. He can take that dead animal and use it for meat, or use it for skins, or whatever he decides to do with it. If one man's ox hurts another so that it dies, and they shall sell the live ox and divide its price equally, and also they shall divide the dead ox, or if it is known that the ox was previously in the habit of goring, yet its owner has not confined it, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal shall become his. Restitution. Appropriate restitution is being considered for Israel in these kinds of cases. It goes into great detail, God does, with these specific cases. And the reason is because they've got to know how to deal with these situations. The judges that judge on these matters have to have the case law in front of them to be able to handle these kinds of situations as they are approached with them. Any questions or comments before we get into chapter 22? Yes? Yes. They weren't just wandering constantly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365. Yes, they wandered eventually in the wilderness, but they would stop occasionally and settle for a while. So they had to have these regulations. They had to have these rules in place to govern what they were doing. Otherwise, it would be mass chaos. They wouldn't know how to handle these kinds of situations. Steve? Yes, yes. The intent that God had was that in just a short order, they would be in Canaan. They would take Canaan. They would have it for their land. But as we know, as what's going to happen, they're going to turn away from God and they will suffer the consequences. Chapter 22 deals with property rights. The principle of property rights is enunciated by God through Moses to the Israelites. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. So you've got to pay back. You've stolen something that doesn't belong to you. You've got to pay back to the owner of it. If the thief is caught while breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there will be no blood guiltiness on his account. Justifiable homicide. Somebody breaks into your house, well, you've got a right to defend yourself. Now, I might be not stating it properly, but there's a difference in stopping the person, either shooting them or hitting them so that they are incapacitated, and then while they're lying on the floor, you start beating them in the head with a baseball bat or shooting them full of bullets. That's retaliation. That's vengeance, as far as I can understand it. I may be completely wrong about that, but still, you have a right to defend your property, have a right to defend your home, your family. And that's what God is enunciating here. But, verse 3, if the sun has risen on him, there will be blood guiltiness on his account. Killing one who doesn't deserve it, in other words. He shall surely make restitution. If he owns nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If what he stole is actually found alive in his possession, whether an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. Protecting the property of the individual that's being stolen from. If a man lets a field or vineyard be grazed bare and lets his animal loose so that it grazes in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. You don't have control of your animals, and it's going into somebody else's property and destroyed it. You've got to make restitution. Similar legislation about this can be found in several ancient Near Eastern law codes, including the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi has very similar language and very similar circumstances that is enunciated. If a fire breaks out and spreads to thorn bushes, so that stacked grain or the standing grain or the field itself is consumed, he who started the fire shall surely make restitution. Oh, I didn't mean to burn up all this property. Well, you started the fire and you didn't control it. Isn't that what we're seeing in California a lot of times? The out-of-control brush fire. Someone starts a fire and they don't control it, and all of a sudden it just gets out of hand, just goes completely all over the place. Well, God is protecting property here. He says you are going to make restitution if you are responsible for that and let it go out of control. If a man gives his neighbor money or goods to keep for him and is stolen from the man's house, and it is stolen from the man's house, if the thief is caught, he shall pay double. If the thief is not caught, then the owner of the house shall appear before the judges. Other translations perhaps say to God or in other renderings. to determine whether he laid his hands on his neighbor's property. The idea here is that you're going to the tabernacle, the sanctuary, or you're going to the temple later on. You're going to the place where judgment is rendered. For every breach of trust, whether it is for ox, for donkey, for sheep, or for clothing, or for any lost thing about which one says, this is it, the case of both parties shall come before the judges. He whom the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. What God intended for Israel to be governed by after they were in Israel, or in Canaan, were to be the judges. The judges were the ones that were to be in control. God would be king. The judges would be in control over the day-to-day affairs of Israel. But as we will see later on, much later on, they reject that system. And they desire a king to be like the nations around about them. Samuel gets upset about it. God says, they're not mad at you, they're mad at me. They're rejecting me. They're rejecting my authority. The judges are the ones to take care of these situations. If a man gives his neighbor a donkey, an ox, or a sheep, or any animal to keep for him, and it dies or is hurt or is driven away while no one is looking, an oath before the Lord shall be made by the two of them that he has not laid hands on his neighbor's property, and his owner shall accept it, and he shall not make restitution. But if it is actually stolen from him, he shall make restitution to its owner. If it is all torn to pieces, let him bring it as evidence. He shall not make restitution for what has been torn to pieces. If you got evidence that this animal is now destroyed, well, no restitution. If a man borrows anything from his neighbor, and it is injured or dies while its owner is not with it, he shall make full restitution. If its owner is with it, he shall not make restitution. If it is hired, it came for its hire. So, the borrower was responsible for the animal borrowed if the owner were not on guard with it. You've got to be responsible with somebody else's property. That's the principle that's being enunciated. Now, verse 16. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her, he must pay a dowry for her to be his wife. Now, similar customs of this kind of law existed in Babylonian law codes. This is not out of the ordinary. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the dowry for virgins. So you're making sure that things that are proper are being followed. Even if something like this happens, there's things to handle this kind of a situation that will take place. Verse 18 then says, you shall not allow, the New American Standard Bible says, a sorceress to live. King James famously says, you shall not allow a witch to live. That's an unfortunate rendering of that Hebrew word. It's not witch. Sorceress is better. Sorceress is a better way of putting it. You say, well, what's the difference? Well, witch has with it certain connotations because of fiction, because of movies and things of that nature. Even back in the 1700s, 1600s in the United States, the Puritans and their attitude toward witches and things of that nature. It's just the word itself does not match what we think of when we think of a witch with a pointy hat and all of that. We're talking about a sorceress. Perhaps someone who seduces is perhaps a better rendering for this. So what's at work? It's a woman who perhaps practices enchantments, who practices what we would call sorcery, yes. But, interestingly, the Septuagint translation of this, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, uses a more generic word, which would include male sorcerers. It's not just singling out women. This is either a male or a female sorcerer or a sorceress. And this is the principle throughout the Old Testament law. These principles apply to both men and women. So when he says you shall not allow a sorceress to live, this is anyone who practices what's being considered. Perhaps some have suggested, and I think there's a good reason to think this, that this describes an individual, whether it's male or female, who tries to seduce other people. That is, it's more of a sexual kind of thing. This person is charismatic. This person draws people to him or her. And as a result, this person seduces, puts a spell, if you want to put it in that way, over individuals where they don't follow the law. And that's a serious matter. Proverbs chapters 5 and 6 describes this kind of individual. So perhaps that's what he's talking about more than the practice of witchcraft or of sorcery. It's an individual who seduces other people away from God. And that makes a lot more sense to me in context of what we're talking about here. Verse 19. Whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. Bestiality, which was a despicable practice then, and it's a despicable practice now. And yet, in our day and time, in 2020, you actually have individuals that practice this and who advocate for it, believe it or not. And yet God says it's a serious matter. He who sacrifices to any god other than to the Lord alone shall be utterly destroyed. Israel would completely obliterate that command later on, when they just openly worship idol gods, even in the temple itself. By the time of Ezekiel, what have you got? You've got the priests holding the branch to their nose toward the sun, worshiping the sun. You have women who are weeping over Tammuz, one of the gods that were worshipped by the pagans. And it's being done in the temple itself. So this kind of command was completely ignored by the time you come to Ezekiel's day. Verse 21, you shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. God is telling the Israelites, remember where you came from. Remember who you were. You were a stranger. You were oppressed. You were in the land of Egypt for over 400 years. You were crying out, your ancestors were crying out to me for relief. And so when a stranger comes in, don't wrong that individual. Don't oppress him. Because remember where you came from. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. The widows and the orphans. There's a special place in the heart of God for widows and orphans. Special place. God always makes provision, special provision for widows and orphans. And the same principle would be enunciated in the New Testament, wouldn't it? Pure religion and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit, that is to care for the widows and the fatherless in their affliction, and keep oneself unspotted from the world. The widows and the fatherless. The widows and the orphans. The first major problem that came up in the early church was the care for the Grecian widows. Something had to be done. And God determined what that would be. Yes, sir? There can be some parallels drawn to that. The people claim to be worshiping the God of heaven, and yet they're following their own way in religion. You can see some parallels. We actually have religions in this country that worship other gods openly. Hinduism, for example. Buddhism, another example. And so you've got these false ways, and God has specifically said, don't follow after them. Worship me and me alone. So that there are some parallels to be drawn to that. I appreciate that point, because we've got to worship according to the way that God has instructed and follow His instructions as He has given them to us. So, verse 23, he continues to describe this. If you afflict him at all, and if he does cry out to me, talking about the stranger that comes in your land, the widow and the orphan, I will surely hear his cry, and my anger will be kindled, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. This would explain why God brought the Assyrians on the northern kingdom and why he brought the Babylonians on the southern kingdom. Because by the time you have Nebuchadnezzar coming in with his armies into the southern kingdom, what's the situation in Jerusalem and in Judah? You've got the widows and the orphans being oppressed. Justice has gone out the window. They're not following after God's law. And as a result, God removes his presence from the temple and it opens the door for the Babylonians to come in. Verse 25, if you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you're not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you are to return it to him before the sun sets. For that is his only covering. It is his cloak for his body. What else shall he sleep in? And it shall come about that when he cries out to me, I will hear him, for I am gracious. The word is compassionate here. Yahweh's protection of those who are less fortunate is based on his compassion. Compassion. That is emphasized in the New Testament to us. You shall not curse God, nor curse a ruler of your people. That's respect for authority. And later on, in Acts chapter 23, Paul quotes this when he says, God shall strike you, you whited wall. You speak ill of God's high priest? I did not know that he was a ruler, because the law says you shall not curse a ruler of your people. Now the question is, was Paul being sarcastic because he knew the situation that existed between the high priest and his father? Or was he being sincere? Well, we don't hear the tone of his voice. We don't know. He simply quotes the law. It may be that he's saying, I can speak ill of this individual because he's not the true ruler of Israel. Interesting. You shall not delay the offering from your harvest in your vintage. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. It shall be with its mother 7 days. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. And here's a summary of what's been said thus far. What's the purpose of all of this? What's the point? You shall be holy men to me. Therefore you shall not eat any flesh torn to pieces in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. That first phrase, you shall be holy to me. Not going to be the last time we see that phrase mentioned by God through Moses to the Israelites. Holiness. What Randall Bailey spoke about Wednesday night, based, rooted in what we're talking about here, that's the point. Holiness. Separateness. Holiness means to be separate. Separate from the world. Separate from pagan religion. The Israelites are to be separate. Holy. Dedicated fully to God. And not dedicated to any other system that takes away from the knowledge of God himself. Any questions or comments before we close this morning? All right, well, next week then we will enter into chapter 23 and continue our study of the law of Moses.